about us at Women Ed. That'd be great. And as you're putting into the chat, make sure you set it to all panelists and attendees so that we can also see where you're, so that everyone joining us can see where you're joining from as well.
I'm going to share my screen shortly, but when we have a few more attendees here. Hi there, Andrea. Please do tell us where you're listening in from today in the chat if you haven't already. It would be nice to know.
Welcome, Susie. Great to see you online as well.
Hi there, Amy.
Yeah. So let us know in the chat function that if you set it to all panelists and attendees, then we can all see where you are coming from. And perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself. I'm personally zooming in from Berlin in Germany, and I'm working from home today. And so, but I'm normally at Berlin International School as well.
Amy's in Geneva. Great. Thank you for introducing yourself, Amy.
Great that you could join us as well. I know that some of you, your schools are still in session. If you're like me, it's the last week of school this week. And so it's a very busy period. And so thank you for taking the time to join us.
Well, that's amazing, Andrea. She's from Vilnius, Lithuania, and she heard about this from the ALOG group on Facebook. Fantastic. Very nice to see you here.
Welcome.
We have Jane as well. Jane, if you've just joined, I think I know you're in Vienna, I believe. But if you could tell us where you're listening in from today, that would be awesome. I'm Kyra, by the way, and I'm in Barcelona, so representing Women Ed Spain, from also working from home.
Welcome. Welcome, everybody. It's great, actually, in Lithuania. I was recently in Kaunas, in Lithuania, the second largest city there, and visiting a school there. And what a wonderful country and a great place for women leaders, actually, in Lithuania. They have one of the highest rates in Europe of females in leadership positions in education.
Beautiful city as well.
Yeah.
Pauline O'Brien's here. She's been a staunch supporter. I think she's been to every single one of the Heart to Hearts. So welcome, Pauline.
Heart to you, Pauline.
I can see Ross has joined us as well. And if you could let us know where you're joining us from, Ross, that would be great. And Jane as well. And Elizabeth. We'll get started in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Susie in Munich, of course. Yeah. I think we have someone else from Munich. Maybe Jane is in Munich. Ellen has introduced herself to the group. She's an international educator and researcher based in Spain. Fantastic.
Yes. Yes, welcome everybody. It's great that you could all join us today. And we're very lucky to have Jane Larson here with us. I'm Angeline and I'm zooming in from Berlin. And my colleague Kyra from Women Ed Spain is coming in from Barcelona.
So I think what I'll do is I'll get up a background behind us and just share my screen quickly so that we can make a start.
Hi, Elizabeth. Welcome from Genoa in Italy. It's great to have you with us.
Let me know, Angeline, if you can see the screen.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Fantastic.
It's perfect. All right. Okay, I think I'll get started. So thank you for joining us on our heart-to-heart conversation. Kyra and I got together from Women at Spain and Women at Germany when we couldn't have our live events in our own countries and cities, and decided to launch this opportunity for us to hold spaces where we could have conversations from what we find are topics of importance that are coming up from Women Ed. So one of them being, of course, women in leadership is at the key of what we do. And we're very lucky today to have Jane Larson from the Council of International Schools with us to talk about shaping the new normal. And just to give you a little bit of background about Women Ed, our heart-to-hearts, as I mentioned, began during lockdown, and we want to make sure that we're connecting with one of the 8 key values of Women Ed. And today's conversation really focusing on the challenges that have arisen, and also thinking about how we can institute change for a better future for all of us in working in education together.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that, this project began during lockdown because we saw that so many women in the Women Ed networks were feeling isolated, were dealing with a lot of the same issues, and that it brought together our communities in a different way. It made sure that we could work in a truly European way for Angelina and I, but also that, we could broaden out the discussion to cover more groups and more regional leaders across the world. So it's really something that we hope to continue long after COVID is gone.
Yeah, and we also welcome everyone within the Women Ed community but also people who are maybe new to the community and are just supporters of us. And so if you are a he for she out there, also it's great that you can listen in and also join us and to engage in conversations with us as well. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah. So just a few housekeeping notes for our Women Ed. In this webinar, we can't hear you. So please use the Q&A function to post your burning questions or select reply to all panelists and attendees when typing into the chat. I'll also keep an eye on the chat function for questions there. And of course, like as we are conversing, please use the chat function to interact, to tell us what you're thinking, maybe your response, or to share your own connections of ideas that resonate with you. And we will not be using the raise your hand feature on this webinar. So do use those 2 opportunities to share ideas in the Q&A on the chat function. A recording of this will be posted on the Women Ed Leaders YouTube channel. At the moment, we're live on there. And so if you want to share a recording with your networks after this has finished, that would be great. And keep continuing to engage with our community using these hashtags, Women Ed, or and also with the hashtag heart to heart. And then you can see down there the Twitter handles for Jane as well. And I'd like to introduce Jane now.
Move across. Sorry. Yep.
All right. So Jane, as you know, is the executive director of the Council of International Schools. She's worked there for over 10 years now, and she's joining us from Leiden today. And she's also had former roles with ISS, International School Services, if I'm getting that right, and director of partnerships at the Visiting International Faculty Program. And during her time at the Council of International Schools, she's also been the chair of the International Task Force on Child Protection since 2014. And she contributes blog posts as well to the CIS blog. And it was also some of those things that she wrote about in that blog that have inspired parts of our conversation today as well, which we'll share with you later. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you. Hi, and good morning, everyone. Really glad if you're here in Europe, good morning. It's really great to be here. Thanks so much, Kyra and Angeline, for inviting me. I hope our conversation is able to help some people.
I'm sure it will. Thank you so much for joining us, Jane. And you have a long and distinguished career that we could have spent 3 or 4 minutes introducing you. But I wonder if you could tell us in your own words a little bit about your journey towards working from the classroom to working in this international education sphere as a leader.
Yeah, I'm happy to. My parents were both educators, and of course I became a teacher, a French teacher actually early in my career, but then I quickly moved into human resources and management, actually in private industry in the US. Realized I really like to work with adults, and I had a tremendous opportunity to get involved with a professional development program, developing one for adults. So that was the first third of my career, which I then left, got married, had a family, and my wonderful daughter. And I found ISS by, I guess it was a random, I saw an ad on the newspaper for a part-time job. My daughter was pretty young and said, oh, this looks really interesting to me, as a former teacher of French. And so that's what got me started in international education. And I just loved my time with ISS. There, I got to know so many people around the world looking for jobs internationally, or school leaders themselves looking to find teachers and other leaders for their schools. And then I had the opportunity to join VIF, the Visiting International Faculty Program, which does what I'll call the opposite. I was seeing at ISS so many teachers leave the US and move internationally, and a lot of them not come back. And at the same time, I'm a product of public education myself. It's like, well, who's going to come to teach children in US public schools? And VIF was bringing up to 700 educators from other countries to the US to immerse themselves in the US educational system. And that work at VIF was transformative for me, because it was a wonderful way to see the US through other people's eyes. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is such an interesting experience that changed the way I looked at international education. So I think coming to CIS then, a third role I've had in international education, I never would have been able to do this job if I hadn't had both experiences. Working primarily with US-based organization, sending primarily Americans overseas, and then bringing people from so many different countries and cultures into the US. So I'm grateful for those experiences every single day.
Yes, and it must make you something of a cultural chameleon too now, the ability to exist in lots of different cultural contexts.
I wish. I think, as we know, we're always doing our best, right, to navigate, move in and out of these different conversations. So it's we're all a work in progress.
Well, in a blog post back in March, which now seems like it was maybe 50 years ago, you wrote about managing uncertainty. And you said, I quote you here, you said, "Managing uncertainty is now my most important role." Those words really stuck with us. And we thought about subsequent events, of course, that are shaping the global community, not just COVID, but everything else that has happened in terms of signaling and understanding racial inequalities since. How have you felt that the global community has dealt with those things within the role that you are in, and how has your leadership style had to adapt during all of this?
Yeah, well, it's been an incredible year for all of us, and we're still in the middle of it, and it's confusing. I feel like we're going down a path that has so many turns, and you can't really see around the turn. So immediately, I think it was mid-March, I actually wrote a retrospective about the decision-making points we made along the way, starting from those early rumblings, at least in January. We're like, oh, well, this is going to be something in Asia, right? And then all of a sudden, February, we saw it start to impact our visits, our accreditation visits. We started to get worried about where we were sending university admissions people to meet with students. And then gradually we got into March, where slowly the wave kept rolling across the world, and one by one things started shutting down. It was March 16th, we realized we're done. Almost everything we do involves traveling, sending a group of people or to another country to do something. Right. And we have a huge responsibility, because it isn't just our staff, it's volunteers from universities and schools, right? The accreditation visits, and Angeline, you know that well, that experience. And then also the university reps trying to meet students and recruit their next class. And so on that day, it was pretty sobering. We gathered together and we sat down, and I think at that point, just like all of you, many of us were just still stunned at what was happening and trying to come to grips with it. And I remember that day, there were two important things we talked about. One was, okay, we don't know what's going to happen. Are we going to continue just to manage uncertainty and the anxiety that comes with that? Is that going to be our lives now for the rest of the year? As we try to make decisions, it was every single one, can we do this? Can we do that? Or are we going to make decisions that are within our control? And I think we've all desperately wanted to take back that control, if you will, because it was taken from us in a way. So we started to think carefully about what were going to be the values or the guiding principles on which we were going to make decisions. And we realized early on, first, we had to take care of ourselves, that if we weren't safe or healthy, if we were at risk, no one was going to be able to do anything because we wouldn't be here to do it. And we realized that, and to do that, that we wanted to preserve, first of all, also our jobs, our livelihoods, and be able to move forward. Secondly, we mentioned our volunteers. We have a tremendous responsibility when we're sending people around the world. So again, health, safety, avoiding risk. So pretty early on, we made the decision to cancel all of our physical events through the end of the year. Because we said, if we put our health and safety first, and if we then take back and realize, no, we can't predict how or when we'll be able to do this, we knew that we had to change everything into some sort of virtual engagement, just like you've done. And you explained at the beginning, right? Couldn't have the conference in May, let's connect virtually. I'm glad to say a lot of those efforts have been very successful, as we've all know, whether we wanted to or not, we've all embraced our new virtual world, some days more than we would like to, but let's see where we go with that. So that's where, again, that question, the skill, the competency, managing ambiguity, that was the second thing we discussed that day. So we realized that if we want to take back control and start making some decisions so that we can work on things we know we can manage and do, that was a big shift for us and a successful one, I think. But at the same time, just that ongoing global uncertainty that we're even seeing now as we think things are getting better and then they aren't again, that not everyone has the skill to manage ambiguity. Some people are quite comfortable with it. I think as you each think to yourselves about your own colleagues, look to your left, look to your right, who's kind of thriving in this scenario. I've met people who've said, yeah, I'm kind of energized by it, right? It's exciting and dynamic. I like the uncertainty. Whereas I've noticed other people struggle, who like to have everything planned and very structured, and who need a lot of support right now. So I think we together talk a lot about that at CIS, the fact that we have to be sure we're supporting everyone, people who need more support right now around that very difficult skill that we just don't all have.
Sure. And I'm sure in her next questions, Angeline's going to get a little bit more to the other uncertainties and the other pieces of the puzzle that have come into play since COVID. But I think the first thing you've started with is wellness. The first thing that you've identified is how to keep your people healthy, safe, and reassured. And I think that's already speaking to your leadership style, that servant leadership that you embody. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was also something I connected with. So firstly and foremost, you were thinking about creating a safe spaces for people and checking in on colleagues in order to do that. I mean, I remember very well back in January, my director and myself, we attended the Intercultural Learning Symposium in Leiden. And while we were there was a case of COVID in our school community. And so he was having to manage things also from afar. And at that time it was, we were thrown into things that we didn't know. And even if we have different levels of comfort with managing ambiguity, I think by several months later down the track, everybody has had to be resilient, and we're at a place where we've come through that. And so hopefully we've all picked up some skills that will help us to bring ourselves into the next steps in the future. And I was wondering, Jane, too, that the values that you've had to draw upon throughout this global crisis, how do you feel that these values and the attitudes have perhaps impacted the work that you do now, perhaps versus the start of your career, because the world has really changed, and what are the big major differences that you've noticed?
Yeah, probably thinking about it. I mean, my whole life, go back, my parents taught us, myself and my 4 brothers, to be kind above anything. I think, no matter who it is who's coming into your life, they deserve your full attention and your support, and to try to always approach life that way. So even now I realize I'm a pretty even-keeled person. I like to think I'm pretty resilient, or will just, persevere and move through things. But one thing that does kind of stop and get my attention, that I actually don't tolerate very well, is when I see someone being unkind to someone else. It just isn't, there's no reason for that to happen at any time. And so because of that, I value collaboration also, I think. And I think more so, like, even looking at the values of women's ed, as you see collaboration and confidence and things like that. I think really, I think we can build our confidence when we realize, even if, let's say, if we are working with someone who's struggling right now, maybe someone takes an action that might surprise you or even frustrate you. Say, why are they doing that right now? To realize maybe there are things going on in their life, that we don't know about, that's causing them to act that way. So I always try to think that anyone is going into something with the absolute best intentions. And I find that a really powerful way of kind of like setting your mental model, if you will, to really always be just focusing on that in any conversation you go into. So I think that sustains me, keeps me going. And of course, wonderful colleagues. I mean, I've met some incredible people, like Angeline. I've known you for a while. I've just met you, Kyra, but you're incredible people doing wonderful work. And I really appreciate talking to my colleagues who are working in different organizations, leading different organizations, who are facing similar challenges about how they're approaching things. And I think this, because if you take that learning mindset, really it makes it a lot easier if we try to take a more collaborative approach to problem solving.
Great. Wow. I think that really captures who you are. And from as long as I've known you, Jane, when we had a great opportunity to meet face to face, I always felt that you not only respected others and valued people's best intentions, but also have always treated everybody with dignity. And I really appreciate that about you. In the there was another CIS newsletter that was posted back in June, perhaps just a few weeks ago on the 17th of June. And you wrote, and I'd like to read a little bit about what you wrote. You wrote, what has been a significant shift in thinking for me personally is that the broad umbrellas of global citizenship and intercultural understanding, while key foundational concepts for learning and development, are not enough. By assuming that racial injustice and each specific form of racial injustice is covered under these umbrellas, the unintended consequences is a lack of recognition and understanding of the specific ways we can and should address it. Thank you for those words. And perhaps you can tell us some more about your shift in thinking and the actions arising from this recognition and reflection to rebuild institutions moving forward.
Yeah, it's been, I've found the events of the last month, since May 25th, that was the day that George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, have been provocative and emotional. And emotional because of the personal story of one of my colleagues, Nunana Naomi. He wrote his personal story about 2 weeks after that day. And the reason he did is he was surprised, shocked, and frustrated at the lack of my response and our organizational response. And I didn't realize that. When we sat down after he published his blog and talked through our reactions to the events of that day and too many others like it, I realized just how different our perspectives were. One of the things Nunana said to me is, how come you didn't call me, right away? And I remember thinking, well, it never occurred to me to call him. I mean, he's my friend and my colleague, but it just didn't occur to me to reach out to him specifically because of what happened. And then I realized when he wrote his blog how painful that event was to him personally, and and the challenges that he was going through as a result. And the fact that I didn't realize that made me feel really sad, really sad. And then I started thinking about all these other experiences that maybe people just aren't telling us about. So we actually sat down and comparing what was he thinking and feeling, what was I thinking and feeling. And it's not often that your perspective on how you go about something is important as intercultural understanding and global citizenship. I mean, these are the foundations of what we do at CIS. And I always thought they were sufficient, as I mentioned. But after talking with Nunana that day, after reading his story, after reading the story of Rachel Engel and others who've been educated in international schools, and then hearing how our actions are not sufficient, that if we don't point out specific types of racism in its various forms, that it's meaningless what we're doing because we're not connecting with somebody's specific experiences. So I think these personal stories, one at a time, will hopefully help. It helped me develop my understanding and perspective where I now have more clarity personally about how we need to move forward. And as the executive director of CIS, I can do a much better job now using all the tools at our disposal to move forward to address this. So again, it's been very emotional and really sad, but it's been a profound shift in thinking.
I feel very moved by what you just said, and I think a lot of people will resonate with that. And thank you for being so open and so forthright in your acceptance of what you didn't know. I think that's the first start. That's the starting point for everybody. That's all anybody wants us to be able to do. And you've said yourself, you've recognized that CIS has not just a duty, but also a massive ability, a massive opportunity here. So as an accrediting body, we've seen there have been calls online, petitions online as well, for encouragement to put pressure on accrediting organizations to really see how they can make substantial structural changes in practices of hiring and inclusion and equity, and also things like the curriculum that is being offered in different international schools. It's a huge responsibility, but an opportunity. What do you see, or what have you committed to first as one of those membership organizations?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm really interested in reading and learning, as we all are at CIS, are focusing on this as much as we can to develop our own understanding, and it continues to develop. So, to the extent that it's possible to consume, webinars and posts and blogs and have personal conversations, we're doing that. What we realize is while accreditation is really, it's a powerful lever for change in education, isn't it? Even when we went about with the Child Protection Task Force, we realized that no matter how much we educated ourselves and learned from experts, that nothing would probably really happen if it wasn't going to be measured or evaluated in some way. And it was for that reason that we got every single body we knew that was responsible for quality assurance and international education in some way together to sign on and adopt common principles and understandings that led to a change in the standards that are used when we evaluate schools. So a number of people have pointed that out and said, can't we do the same now? And I think we can. We absolutely can. I think, again, there are ways we can be much more specific and intentional about how we help educational community schools and universities, to foster discussion and dialogue on this topic through that process. Now, at the same time, as a membership community at CIS, we accredit about 600 schools around the world. We have about 750 schools and another 600 universities. So that's another 750 institutions that are outside the accreditation process. So as we take up this important responsibility, our board met, we had a meeting on Tuesday, we're setting up a committee specifically to look at all the tools available at our disposal, starting with our guiding statements, our code of ethics, I think also our understanding or definition of global citizenship is not specific enough. I think it'll be very interesting to include all of our members in looking at that definition, if you will, or our understanding of what it is and how we can make it more meaningful, how it can really connect. So I think, again, while accreditation is very important, I think we will look at those standards. That will come soon, that we will look at that, but we have to start more broadly with other practices, including, hiring, selection processes. You mentioned curriculum. There are so many calls for looking at what we teach, aren't there? This is going to be, I think, a big and broad topic for every organization involved in not just international education, but education.
Yes, you've already mentioned some very clear, actionable things there. And what I like is that CIS has been one of the first organizations to commit to measurable actions. I think that's something that should be applauded. What else should we be looking out for, in your opinion, either from representing the organization or for yourself? What else should we be looking out for from similar organizations, similar bodies? What would be your call to action to your peers, for example, there?
Yeah, well, we're already having those discussions. I met last week and we'll be actually publishing another recording. We actually recorded the conversation I had with Nunana, by the way, because just stepping back for a minute, when we realized how different our views were, we said, why don't we just talk about it and record it? Because it might be helpful to our colleagues. So we did that. Then our colleagues at CIS. When our colleagues at CIS said, actually, this was really helpful to me to listen to this, we're actually going to share it with our members. We then, I met with some leaders of other international organizations to talk in general about the pandemic, what it's done to international education, and we broached this topic as well. But starting with we found we were all sharing the same awareness that first we have to educate ourselves. We don't yet know what we don't know. We have a lot to learn from the diverse perspectives in our communities, and that's going to be our first task. So I think primarily everyone realizes that one of the things no one wants to do is to do kind of a knee-jerk, let's change our website tomorrow. Let's put a statement up on our website and okay, we've done that. It has to be thoughtful and it has to be inclusive, whatever we do. So people, and that can be frustrating to some because, you're not seeing a lot of visible action right now. So I think what we all realized also is that while at the same time, we have to take a thoughtful approach to first educate ourselves, we also have to do a better job letting everyone know what we are doing, what process we're using to go about, because we do take this seriously. We will address it and just make sure people are aware of what that process is and how they can be involved in it.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Angeline because I think she has something to ask you about systems change there. And I think that follows on really nicely.
Yeah. Before I do, I'd also like to just say that there are been some comments on the side here, and Susie March has said that thank you very much for your humbling reflections as well, and that people are grateful that we're bringing up the anti-racism, and because it's important to not just to talk about it, but also to move to action, which from what you've shared, the CIS is doing. So we also wanted to ask you that how do you see some current changes in our systems playing out beyond 2020?
Well, I think if we believe for 1 second that anything that we've done so far this year won't persist, then we're not living in reality. And, it's just, I think things have fundamentally changed forever. And people now are questioning how education is delivered, what we teach, and I think the experiential aspect of education has come right into focus, hasn't it? As we're seeing right now with so many young people, particularly those who are graduating from secondary school this year, saying, you know what, if I can't go and have an international experience in higher ed, I'm not going to go because I can learn online, but part of it is the experience. I think that's a message that we're still hearing, starting to hear, that we need to really understand what the long-term implications are if people actually can't travel to a different country, culture, or system to actually engage in education. Watching that very, very carefully. And overall, again, that sense of well-being, I think we have to go back, first of all, and realize that in a crisis, people don't want to move. They really, and sometimes it's almost counterintuitive in some ways, because you would think, okay, a crisis, unemployment, no job, I have to go somewhere else for one. But that isn't people's first tendency. They do kind of hunker down, if you will. So I think we will continue to see a lot of students taking a year off rather than engaging and moving to a new destination, a new country this year. And then what are the implications for the following year? And how soon will we recover from the virus? No one knows the answers to these questions, but I think social behavior, social emotional education, looking at well-being, I hope that as schools do open up again, that we don't focus right back in on content, but first we do focus first on the social emotional aspects and provide plenty of time and space to actually listen, understand what young people are thinking and feeling. There are even debates right now going on about how much they've been impacted, how much anxiety has this given people, what kind of choices are they making, and how are we going to support them going forward. So at least those are the first and most important issues that are on my mind as we figure out what to do next.
Thank you. And I think a good follow-on question from this is perhaps a question that Jane Holdaway sent to us prior to our webinar. She asked, she said, we have grown and developed as educators rapidly in the last few months. What changes in the way we do things brought about by the crisis do you think are worth striving to keep? So you mentioned the focus on well-being, but do you think there's something else that perhaps that has been brought about by the crisis that you think are worth taking it with us into the future?
Yeah. Well, broadly, I mean, I think it is a time to examine how we live our lives, isn't it? Not just at work, but at home. People are going back, taking up hobbies they've long since abandoned. Particularly, I'm looking arts, crafts, gardening, baking. What happens when you can't move? And particularly as international educators, I'm assuming everyone on this call is engaged in a lot of travel. What have you picked up again? That you don't want to just drop, that you really say, I enjoy this, it gives me greater balance in my life. So then related to that, flexible working conditions, being able to work virtually, hybrid education. If you're a teacher, if you're a leader, do you have to go into school every day? Do your students, how will we use this technology in education? So I think, again, more broadly about just life in general and work, that it is a time for all of us, no matter where you work in your community, to come back and talk about what those changes are and some things that we really do want to keep doing, even if it is possible for us to go back to the way things used to be.
I'm going to add in a question there from another participant, because it addresses the teaching aspect of this. So, of course, your focus on wellness for students is incredibly timely, incredibly important. It's kind of a wave that we had seen coming for many years. But I feel that there's also an increased need to look at teacher well-being in a much more intentional way. So we have teachers who are asking, how do we ensure that as leaders, we are also able to protect our staff, but for ourselves are able to take the time to make sure that we come out of this. We keep our energies up in this new shifting context. What advice or recommendations have you seen that you might be able to offer there to the teaching staff amongst us?
Yeah, to focus on that as a fundamental conversation that has to take place amongst leadership and staff, even as school continues or changes. When I mean, physical school, if you will, we have to start those conversations now. Probably we have to start doing a lot of very specific surveys just to, first of all, figure out how people are doing, and then figure out how we're going to go about and support wellness through the changes that have been made to the educational routine, if you will. We're seeing a lot of requests come in for to be able to recommend experts, counselors, those who can foster that kind of dialogue and discussion in communities for educators themselves and for students. So I think not forgetting or not neglecting any segment. I've noticed myself in conversations I'm having just what an impact the uncertainty, the changes are having on school leaders. And for example, we know that there are a number of independent, smaller schools that are probably going to close or go out of business. We also know there are a number of international education programs that are at risk in higher education. And when we talk with people about these changes, they can't really see what next year is going to look like, about the future viability of their institution. And so I've been taking time to call people when we find out that their institutions are in trouble, either that they've cut most of their staff or that they don't know whether they're going to have the money to sustain their educational programs. And these conversations have been so important for me to really hear. Sometimes people just get on the line and just talk for half an hour about all the worries and concerns. And in at least half the conversations, people get very emotional and start to cry, just thinking about losing colleagues or just the uncertainty of it all. So people are struggling for a variety of reasons that we've talked about, and in some pain. And there has to be a process for us to at least create ways for people to talk about that together as we come back together. So for the experts out there who work in this area, we have a lot of work to do. Educational communities are going to need you. And as leaders, we have to really be intentional about changing the way our meeting structures work, creating more informal paths for dialogue, particularly when we talk about racial inequality. It's what's the entry point to those conversations? How are we going to make that happen?
There's another question here that I would like to ask, and then I'll hand over to Angeline because I know she's been looking at the chat. Beforehand, before the discussion today, we had teachers sending in questions. And one came in from Amy Skidmore, who's on the call. She talks about many women who are working hard in grassroots educational movements. So it's connected to what you just said about engaging a community. But teachers are also finding their own communities throughout all of this, and Women Ed plays a big part in that. People finding similar voices and aligning themselves with people who may not be in their schools or may not be in their immediate context, who understand their specific challenges. So how do we get this to not be overlooked by senior management? If you're in a school system which is not as supportive as the one you found perhaps online, with peers that you've met in different webinars, with women that you've engaged with, or people of color that you've engaged with in these recent months who really feel what you're feeling, how do we embed that into the culture of schools? What advice would you give to wannabe or existing educational leaders who want to bring this into and embed it within the culture of their organizations, but are having trouble or they find resistance?
Yeah, there's some foundational work that needs to be done. And one of the things that all along we've worked on, for example, at CIS, is every year looking at intercultural competence. Giving people some concepts as a foundation to talk about all sorts of diversity and inclusion. We do still believe that these are basic skills that not a lot of people have or have ever learned about or had specific training in. So I think it's a huge area of growth that's been neglected, particularly for a lot of international educators, because most of us think, and similarly early in my own career, all of us, okay, I'm going to have an international experience. I've learned so much, but it doesn't happen automatically. There is intentional work that has to be done as you think about constantly how you are going to engage with people who are brought up thinking differently than you do. And now again, as a foundation, I think we can all start there. And so if you haven't, I guess, again, get some training in this area. And then it will provide a pathway to get into these very different and specific types of bias, discrimination, inequality, and figure out, how to address each one, because there's so many different forms of inequality out there. So we can do a better job of that. Now, for women specifically, it was interesting. Just this morning, I read a survey that just came out, I think it was published yesterday, from McKinsey, surveying attitudes about people in the pandemic. And it definitely, the experience of women has not been as good as the experience of men. And again, it goes back to that balancing a lot of things. We know already that a group in education, particularly educators who also had young children at home, who are trying to teach online while also making sure their own young children were having an education, were really struggling quite a bit. But it still seems that disproportionately, according to this survey, that women are taking on the major workload here in terms of trying to not only do their jobs, but look after young children. So yeah, I think having discussions, and I was glad actually, Kyra, you mentioned at the beginning, these discussions, by the way, are open to men too, right? Not just women, because, we all have to talk about this together. We're all, living and working, together. And while I think protected conversations for specific groups are useful, then we have to figure out how to integrate and diversify those conversations, to learn more from the perspectives of others.
Thank you for sharing that. And one of our attendees today, I'd just like to read her question out from Eleanor Mora. She says that she appreciates the time to understand, learn, and think about the processes. However, one of the issues defined by the post-George Floyd movement in terms of anti-racism or better HR strategies for international school contexts was that there were segments that were totally voiceless or neglected in international schools. So whilst it is great to take time to process and understand the issues at hand before taking action, Eleanor says that she struggles to believe that there isn't anybody right now in certain places that can be given a voice directly. So are we truly giving voice to the voiceless when we are taking time to understand them or their needs?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there is a starting point right now. I mean, by example, while at CIS as an organization, we're going to take time to figure out how we're going to approach this from a systemic or structural point of view, we can start these conversations, personal conversations, right away. And we will, and we have, for example. So starting with one conversation, and now, for example, this morning, so how are we going to create these informal opportunities for people to talk about their own experiences? I'm sure that I have many other colleagues I haven't heard from yet or talked to about their own experiences, who are probably in just as much pain looking at some of these events as a catalyst for situations they've found themselves in. So, how do I, as the executive director, and how do I work with my colleagues to start these conversations happening sooner rather than later? I've also been looking, and we have a group at CIS set up, a performance development team, to look at this concept of belonging, again, as an entry point to discuss inclusion in any setting, in the workplace, in school. So I think we're looking carefully right now at devising actually a survey for staff to actually probe their own feelings of, and their sense of belonging at CIS, not only as colleagues, but also in terms of how we work together. So I think some of these tools can be very useful, and all of us who have responsibility for any group of people can start identifying those tools and using them right away.
Thank you, Jane. I'd like to offer one sort of snippet of information that I was given by another Women Ed leader this week. She's in the UK. Her name is Hannah Wilson, and she's a diversity and inclusion educator. She runs trainings, leading leaders in educational settings. But she said that as a white woman working in the UK right now, she felt that one of the most impactful things she could do in her position, using her voice, using her power, was to do some radical things. So for example, in every panel she's been invited to speak on, she has challenged the color of the speakers on the panel or the diversity of the speakers on the panel, just to make sure that they are being equitable and inclusive. She also, in any speaking engagement, has taken somebody with her and shared her time on the podium with that person. So she's looking to actively ally herself with voices that need to be heard that she knows would not be otherwise heard. And I'm wondering if you could give us your thoughts on activities like that, on actions that you've seen being taken within the sector that you really respect. That for me really sat with me, and I thought about how we could continue that work, and I found that very inspirational.
Yeah, I think we can learn from all these. I think that I'm glad to learn of that too right now. Because certainly myself, I'm questioning, am I taking the right actions? Who else is doing what? I think learning from each other is so important. So that's why having conversations like this, and even the questions that are coming in, it helps us all think about, what more we can do. I've learned a lot that when you are through the work, again, going back to the task force on child protection, when you have topics that are really difficult and painful, racial inequality is painful experience, being excluded, not having the opportunities or a solid foundation for what you want to do because of who you are, or just like sexual abuse, these are difficult, painful topics. And how do you get people's attention who might not have experienced that particular type of pain to pay attention to something? So we found, again, going back, to get people to get to a place where they're willing to educate themselves about it. I think these personal stories, starting by sharing one person's story, can be very powerful, particularly when it's someone you have a connection with, that you care about, who's your colleague or friend, and you start to see them in a different way. And I've learned that, when you go out, myself, and for example, talking about the task force as an example, if we go out and say, you're doing a terrible job on this, and here's everything you're doing wrong, people don't like to come to those talks and hear about them. Or they send somebody else, or they delegate it, for example, because it's uncomfortable for them, it's painful for them. So I spent a lot of time through that work thinking again about what is that entry point going to be. And I found that, again, by sharing, for example, these individual stories as an entry point was the way to get someone's attention, so that, because these things do have to be led. And leaders can't delegate, for example, fixing racial inequality in their school to someone and say, okay, I've done that. I set up a committee, we're done. Just like improving child protection practices. You have to be involved, you have to go through it with your colleagues, you have to lead it. So getting people's attention is very, very important. So a thoughtful process and actions like you just described, how do you take those actions in a way that will bring people in? So like confronting, for example, my own lack of awareness about what Nunana was thinking and feeling, we did through personal dialogue and awareness that then created a change in my own perspective about how we needed to address this. I don't have all the answers. I can only share, what's happened to me. And I think I'm going to look carefully at some other practices and see what is effective and what isn't, in terms of, again, how do we get people's attention to get involved in this?
Yeah, I think using your voice, you cannot simply be silent. Leadership is about telling your people and helping them understand what you will be experiencing together, but also your style of leadership has shown that you are actively listening and that you are holding space for the colleagues who have stories and opinions that are different to your own. And I think that says a lot, as I said right at the beginning, about your methods. So I thank you for that openness again. Once again, it's something that I think is a difficult process for every leader who's in a position right now where they have to appeal to various interests and speak to everything that's going on. It's been a very rough time. So I'm sure that you yourself need your confidence as well and your supporters, as we all do. This has been a very, very productive chat group as well. We have a lot of comments and questions coming in.
Yes. Yeah. Just to add a little bit to that, I think, leading with vulnerability is something that has risen as a key skill that is really helping people go through this time and this period. And Pauline OBrien has just mentioned in the chat that, we have to be prepared to have these difficult conversations and feel uncomfortable as we learn to move this forward. And these difficult conversations, I feel, have become necessary conversations, so not things to be avoided, but things that we are trying to create spaces for. And also by leaders who perhaps choose not to act, that is actually an action in itself, right? And so so by choosing not to respond, we are actually making a choice, I feel, as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, won't it? Already, my own family, my colleagues, it's really interesting to see who's paying attention to this and who isn't. And if, people are minimizing it or not paying attention, trying to figure out why. So again, right now, thinking, learning, listening, observing, figuring out what those entry points are, really important right now. It's a moment for all of us to have heightened awareness.
You've done really well, I think, Jane, too, on engaging with different groups that perhaps weren't in your periphery before. I don't know if you'd like to speak to any of those groups or organizations that have come into your world recently that you realized, wow, they're championing great things, they're doing great work, and I'd like to mention or recognize them here today, perhaps as a resource for the educators who are here with us today.
Yeah, there's so many groups doing wonderful work. Well, first of all, women's ed, look at the growth. We were actually just talking before everybody signed on about there are whole pockets of people who have no idea this network exists. So there's a lot we can do there, right? And I think other affinity groups, ALOC, for example, I wasn't aware of, and just went to their first webinar. And, having places where people can start sharing a story from common experiences is really powerful. And then how do you, as I said, build that out? I think this concept of building allies is a powerful bridge. Again, because then you're going across the bridge to then connect your own experience with somebody else's experience that's different than yours. So I think that's very useful. Also recently, in the last year, I became aware of a group called TICEP. It's a professional association for international credential evaluators. These are the people who actually do the work of breaking down how someone was educated and or trained, and then making sure, doing the equivalencies of the credentials so that they can, be recognized for their although they were educated differently, it was built differently, they can still get recognition for that and cross a country or a border with their credentials. So again, this goes back again to opening up opportunities for people, across many different countries and cultures. And so I think, again, that's a group, that group is growing exponentially. I think that work is so important. So I guess, again, just two examples of groups that I've become aware of in the last year, and of course, citing the growth of this group too.
Yes, we will offer those resources out in the chat before we finish today. So if you could just tell us how we spell TICEP. We'll make sure we find it.
I'll write to you, TAICEP.
TAICEP, fantastic. And ALOC we know well. Angela and I are members. So we will make sure those resources are shared widely amongst all of the people who joined us today. We've had a really, really productive chat session, lots and lots of people both just feeling that they needed a space to talk about these issues, also that we have recognized that some of these conversations are uncomfortable and that we're not going to have all of the answers in a webinar. But I just think it's really important to share our appreciation for you taking the time. You're a busy woman with lots and lots of plates spinning at the moment. And it's been really fantastic to meet you, hear about the intentional work you're doing, hear about your personal story as well, which I think has connected you in a really meaningful way to all of us who've been here today. And if there's anything else that you'd like us to share out with the Women Ed networks in terms of resources or practices, and if we can help widen membership, of course, because I think one of the things that came up as you were speaking about what CIS can do as a membership organization is that in a way, it's already the best schools who have gone through the process to be members or who are aware of your existence. And I'm also thinking out there about the higher education institutions whose women go through some of the same things that we've lived in schools. If there isn't a way for them to feel so connected, then perhaps sharing some resources that signpost to other similar organizations or ones that are working more with their school bodies in different ways would be useful. But I think it's also really our work as Women Ed leaders to try and promote the benefits of partnership and community and being part of these networks so that you do have a voice in order to create change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your reference to cross-sector work is so important. There are a lot of women in the higher education community that will benefit from this association as well, not just primary and secondary schools. So, really thinking about education more broadly and how we do all these things. So I'm really happy for this first conversation. Really enjoyed it. And thanks so much for reaching out to me. And again, I just hope it's useful or helpful to even one person, then that's fine with me.
We know it's been useful to at least 20 people, and we know there will be more on YouTube, hopefully watching after the fact as well. So
yes, that's right. A recording will be available as well, and I just wanted to also highlight that we're hosting another Women Ed Heart to Heart conversation on Tuesday, the 7th of July at 8 p.m. in the evening, Central European Summertime, and in that we have tried to create a space where Delina Nadronimana, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, and Heidi Bachmann as well, who is a diversity and inclusion specialist. And so we're trying to create these spaces where people, like you say, it's important for us to share our personal stories and giving people a chance to do that, to get people's attention. Because I think at the foundation of all of this is we need people to care about this. And you started by saying that your family instilled kindness as a quality in you, and I really think that that's been at the core, hopefully, of this and this heart-to-heart conversation that you've brought to the table as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks everyone who called in. Thanks Kyra. Thanks Angeline.
We look forward to seeing what you're doing next, Jane, and we will be following you on Twitter. If you'd like to engage with Jane further, I think it's fair to say that I should probably put up a slide. Let me do that. I'm not very ready. I've been sort of taken in by the conversation so much.
And likewise, I'm also interested in listening and learning everything that you're doing, and however we can promote that, at CIS, we're certainly happy to do that.
Fantastic.
Yep.
So I'm just going to
share
my
screen. A lot
screen.
of thank yous from our audience as well. Also, while you're getting that through, thank yous for joining and sharing your thoughts. And I'm glad that this has been useful for you.
Thanks, everyone. There are some links there on the last slide. If you want to connect with any of us on Twitter, you have our handles here. You also have the link to be able to watch the conversation or forward it with colleagues that couldn't make it today on YouTube. So there's a shortened link there. I'm sorry I couldn't get it any shorter. And if you'd like us to send that round in the chat, we can do that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Dankeschön. Ciao.
Bye-bye.